I can. Oh yeah, that doesn't look very good, does it? It looks okay. It looks terrible, but it's not 4x3. It's 16x9.
Okay. Whatever it's in, it's 4x3.
All right.
The people will just look thin.
All right. I mean, there aren't that many pictures of people. So whatever. Doesn't matter. All right. How's everyone doing? All right. My name is Matthew Aubert. I am an incident manager with the Cisco Incident Response Service. As part of that service, we obviously provide incident response capabilities on retainer to customers, and we also provide some proactive functions as well. Incident response recommendations come out of incident response investigations all the time. And this is a presentation on some common recommendations that are pretty typical, and it's based purely on my own experience. How many here are incident responders or perform incident response as a function of their job, right? So probably nothing here is going to surprise you. It's all pretty common security fundamental type stuff. So while I was attending my local ISSA group, who consists mostly of compliance folks, they were having a conversation about nation-state threat actors and advanced threats. And one of the individuals in the group asked me what practical recommendations I would have to secure their enterprise. My response wasn't about defending against nation-state threat actors, because to be honest, if somebody wants to get in, they're going to get in, right? And if they have the right budget to back them. I told them that we need to focus more on security fundamentals, and even though the APT threat is real, coming from a DoD background, I've worked quite a bit in defending networks against nation-state threat actors. The reality is a lot of those nation-states will leverage low-hanging fruit before they move on to more advanced techniques. And if you can't defend yourself from common threats, then how are you going to defend yourself against a nation-state? In this rush to find solutions for advanced threats, we appear to be leaving behind fundamental security. Arguably, most organizations haven't even bothered to secure their networks to begin with. And we see this as evidenced through the spread of ransomware using malicious Office documents and through exploits and patchable browser vulnerabilities as an indication of missing security. Every incident response ends with recommendations to help bolster security. Of those recommendations, these three tend to show up more often, right? There's usually an issue with endpoint hardening. They failed in retaining logs, which had a negative impact to our investigation, and they just didn't plan for an incident to begin with. I'm sure some of you who have experience in this probably have some other opinions on what those common recommendations are, but I'm trying to keep this talk down to 20 minutes. So when it comes to endpoint hardening, simple things like patching, minimizing footprints through STIGs, and it's a little bit of a stretch here, but I'm also going to say network segmentation of your workstations from critical systems also kind of falls into that category. Many major incidents are completely avoidable simply by patching endpoints. Microsoft has had patch management software available for years to allow enterprises to manage their networks, and many organizations just don't simply implement it, or they're not implementing it very effectively. Patches are released every month, typically on the same day, depending on whatever your software vendor is. It shouldn't take more than a business week for these patches to start being deployed to the majority of the enterprise network, but it's not uncommon that we come on site after an incident and find that there are systems that are over a month out of patching, right? Some are worried because they think it's going to impact their business applications, and so rather than testing the patches and deploying them in a timely manner, they just freak out and ignore them, right? And some organizations are running old software. It's not a shock when we come on site and there's a Windows 2000 host that's publicly available, that anybody can reach, right? And there may be a business case to have an old unsupported host online. Maybe a piece of software doesn't run on a newer version of Windows. That's okay to some extent, but you need to make sure that you're protecting that host, that you're segmenting it, that you're monitoring activity in and out of it. And then you should also be planning to retire that system as soon as you can, right? The other thing that we run into is some of our customers have mature security practices where they have strong endpoint security. They have endpoint, advanced endpoint protection deployed to all their workstations, but they don't bother to patch the endpoint security software, or the team that's responsible for managing it isn't a security team, it's a desktop team, and they see it as a nuisance, right? There really isn't any excuse to be running outdated endpoint security software. Patch it. You took the time to buy it. Why not patch it? Remember to make sure you're installing antivirus definitions. And then, most importantly, if the desktop people are going to be responsible for managing this software, you should make sure that they're being held accountable to do so, right? So I'm going to tell a few stories during this presentation. They've all been sanitized, so there's no customer information in here. And if you feel this is targeted towards you, I'm not meaning to embarrass anybody, right? So we were called a little while back to investigate a suspected breach to one of our clients. 12 months prior to this, they had a PCI breach where data was stolen through a publicly exposed Windows 2003 server. This 2003 server was also running remote access software that their remote offices would use to send data, PCI data, into their central office, right? We come on site and we're doing our investigation 12 months after the PCI breach, and that Windows 2003 server that was used to pivot into their network to steal PCI data was still online, still in the same place, and they hadn't added any new security protections to it whatsoever. It was running exactly as it was 12 months prior, and not surprisingly, it was the target of another breach, right? What was most frustrating about it is they had similar hosts configured on the network, but they were running Windows 2008, and they were running newer versions of the remote access software they were using. So clearly they had been upgrading some hosts, but they chose to leave the 2003 host online. When I asked them point blank why they hadn't replaced this 2003 server yet, and they said that it just wasn't in the budget. How could the system not be a priority for replacement, right? The expense of a couple $1,000s for a new server and a new Windows license to avoid being breached again certainly seems like a small price to pay, right? In similar situations like this occur everywhere. Sometimes there's a valid justification to leave an old server online. Maybe an old server's generating millions of dollars in revenue for the business and they don't want to risk taking it off. But you really need to make sure that it's protected and justify its existence still on the network. The legacy software, if you have to run it, you should be developing an upgrade path, build a plan of action to replace old software, and if you really need to keep it online, make sure it's segmented. And certainly make sure it's not just easily publicly available, right? So the second bullet is log retention. Maintaining a log is an item that many organizations we work with will overlook. They might have strong security infrastructure, but the logs aren't retained longer than what the actual security appliance can hold on to them for. It's very difficult for us to resolve incidents fully without logs. Certainly we can figure out certain things, but there's always going to be gaps in the information. With the time to detect incidents being out towards 280 days is the rolling statistic, right? Missing logs in an incident can have severe negative impacts to the investigation. At 60 cents per gigabyte for storage, it really doesn't make any sense to not spend a little bit. You already spent money on the security appliance. Spend a little bit more money and ship those logs off somewhere and store them, so that way when an incident occurs, we can we can go to them. There's plenty of log shipping tools out there like syslog. Event Viewer will do it automatically. Or can do it built in. It doesn't cost you any additional money software-wise to get this running. And if you have the budget, having a sim to correlate events will help you identify events that are related. If you don't have the money, you can set up an elk stack or something similar and aggregate your events and search through them. And another thing that some mature companies tend to skip is retaining logs for critical systems. If you're a hospital and you store PHI information in a database, you should be retaining those logs to that database and monitoring them and seeing who's accessing it, right? Here's another situation that another little story. Many of our investigations rely somewhat heavily on logs. And reviewing logs is almost always one of the first steps that we are involved in when we start an incident response investigation. We had a federal government agency for a foreign government, and it was targeted by another nation state. We were called in to assist and identify the root cause of the compromise. Right off the bat, they didn't have any logs whatsoever. All their network appliances were storing logs locally, and they couldn't retain logs for even an entire day. And by the time we showed up on site, the compromise had happened a month ago, so there wasn't anything left in any other security appliances. So it was very difficult to determine when the event actually originally occurred. To make it worse, while this isn't necessarily directly related to event logs, is through communication with talking with the individuals out there, they had mentioned that a domain controller had been identified to have user credentials dumped to a text file on the file system. Now, it would have been nice to have an image of that domain controller, but they had decided it was a virtual machine, and they decided to just blow out the virtual machine entirely before we showed up and rebuild it from scratch. So all that evidence was gone as well, right? Ultimately, we were able to provide some solid artifacts, and because they did manage to retain a couple of workstations, so it wasn't a total loss. And we were mostly able to prove the theory of who did it and roughly when it started. But it certainly made it a lot harder, right? And if they had continued with this recovery operation, they might have destroyed all the evidence in the process. So critical systems like domain controllers, systems that hold critical information, you can't ignore those logs either. Those need to be retained as well as your security appliances and your network devices that log. So my last bullet here is about incident response planning, right? Incidents are inevitable, so you should plan for the inevitable. A lot of times you come on site and the SOC manager will be ignoring small incidents or small events because he says that they're easily taken care of. But sometimes small events are indicators of a much larger incident. Detections can sometimes occur in the later stages of an attack, and you need to investigate those as well. Another issue we run into a lot is change management, right? We're coming on board to do an investigation, and change management is insisting that we can't do certain things. We have to submit a change, and we got to wait a week before we can collect a disk image, right? That might be a little ridiculous. Or you have overeager desktop or IT folks who are automatically reformatting hosts the second an event flags on it, right? And, as security folks, another issue that I think we have as a group is sometimes we don't document our recommendations very well, right? We maybe put them as a bullet on a slide, but we don't clearly describe what it is we're recommending. So, that should be part of your incident response planning as well as part of your incident response process. You need to be properly documenting your recommendations, right? So, not everyone can afford a full-time 24/7, 365 incident response staff, and that's okay, right? Not every company has the budget to do so, and that's understandable. Sometimes they might need to outsource some of that incident response function to a retainer. There's certainly trade-offs between having an internal incident response team and having an external one. But regardless, you have to have a plan. You need to identify what your incident response methodology is, what your workflow is, and when we come on site, when we're doing an incident response investigation, we're going to fall into your incident response plan. So if you don't have one, it's going to make things more difficult for us because you're going to be confused about what's going on, right? So I'm a big fan of the NIST documents, mostly just because they're fairly thorough. I mean, people may have different opinions on them, but I personally like NIST 861 for the incident response methodology. If you work at an organization that doesn't have an incident response plan, I would strongly suggest that you start with the NIST documents and start writing up an incident response plan when you get back to work, right? And if you plan on retaining an incident response service, your methodology and your incident response workflow should identify where it is that you're going to contact the retainer, right? The reality is that it burns hours, so you need to know when it is, what's that threshold for you that you're going to contact your retainer service. So, change management provides an organization with a method to track and approve changes to the enterprise and ensure minimal impacts when those changes are implemented. But it's not supposed to be a barrier to security. If your change management process is not allowing incident response functions to execute, then you may want to reassess how your change management process works, right? There needs to exist a process to engage emergency changes. Incident responders will always want to collect artifacts from suspect servers, and these artifacts are almost always going to include a memory dump, or they should, and if they don't, then you need to fire your incident response people, right? And to get a memory dump, if it's not a virtual machine, we're probably going to have to execute some sort of utility to get it, right? WinPmem or whatever it is that is your favorite memory dumping utility. The longer we wait for approval from change management to execute utilities to collect forensic artifacts from potentially compromised hosts, the more likely it is that we're going to lose important information. So when you're developing your incident response plan, you need to make sure you work with your change management team to identify how emergency changes are performed. If possible, you should identify what incident response tools you use. But there still needs to be leeway to allow, in emergency situations, to allow the execution of maybe some tools that aren't on your standard list, especially if you're using a retainer service, right? Because you don't know what they're going to come up with. So, I think one of the big problems that we have sometimes as security people in general is that we forget that it's our job is to make sure that the business continues to operate, right? And sometimes that means we have to make compromises in our recommendations to meet business needs. We can do that through creative recommendations. We don't need to tell them to turn off a server, but maybe we could provide them recommendations to monitor and protect that server better, right? It's the business that's important, and we support the business. It's important that we keep that perspective in mind when performing our duties. So, again, I'm Matthew Aubert. Thanks for listening to my short talk. If you want to reach me, there's my email address and my Twitter handle, and you can find my blogs on Medium. Also, afterwards, if you want to share war stories from your incident response, work, then please feel free to. And, just because my company's paying me to be here, I'm going to plug them a little bit. Not that I haven't been the whole time, but there's their number. If you have an emergency and you don't have an incident response service, if you contact Cisco Tech, we do have a emergency service that we provide for customers who aren't on retainer yet, right? And our whole team blogs on the Cisco Security blog. Thank you. It was nice talking to all of you, right?